James Felder. Our hope today is that you'll get a glimpse into our vibrant academic community and see for yourself why this place has become home for so many people. So we hope that you'll leave this session inspired by our talented faculty and excited about the possibility of joining this rich, diverse community of thinkers, scholars, change makers, and go-getters. But before we go any further, just a couple of reminders for you all out there in the audience. You all will be muted for the duration of this event. And while we can't see you, we definitely can feel your energy out there. We won't cover any admissions or financial aid information today, but if you do have any questions about the application process, just visit our website, give us a call, or send an email. Our staff is ready and available to help you with any questions or concerns that you have. If you do have questions about superheroes and the multiverse, we just ask that you use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We are going to do some live Q&A at the end of the session, so please make sure to drop your questions there. So we're going to get started, and I'd like to introduce our Professor Felder. Professor Felder started his career in editorial at Marvel Comics, working on titles such as The Incredible Hulk, Ghost Rider, and Daredevil. While there, he started the company's first writers training program, the Stan-Hattan Project. In animation, he's written for Disney XD, Cartoon Network, and FoxKids on shows such as Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, Spider-Man Unlimited, Ben 10, and Generator Rex, all of which my nephew loves. He most recently wrote Monkey King, The Journey Begins, an animated feature currently in post-production. He teaches TV and screenplay classes in the Department of Dramatic Writing at Tisch, where he is Area Head of Episodic. In this webinar, Professor Felder will discuss superheroes and the multiverse storytelling. Traditionally, because comic books had changing creative teams and a constant influx of new readership, this led to the creation of multiverses to explain different, contradictory stories with the same characters. With the animated feature Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse, the launching on TV of the next phase of the Marvel Cinematic Universe with WandaVison and Loki, and the upcoming Flash movie, our current generation of storytellers have used the multiverse concept to reimagine reboots of franchises and recasting familiar characters as an asset that deepens the audience's enjoyment of every movie they've seen with those concepts and expands the tools we have as creators to deepen story and emotionally move the audience in ways that have never been possible before. With that, Professor Felder, take it away.
Hey folks, how you doing? Let me get my slideshows. Okay, let's get the slide. Okay, good. Slideshow's going. Hey, so as Camille said, my name is James Felder. I teach in the Department of Dramatic Writing at Tisch with a specialty in episodic and feature animation. Animation for TV and movies is what I mainly write. These TV and features that I work on, which often feature superheroes, are just starting to delve deeply into this idea of multiverses. Now, a multiverse, as some of you already probably know, is when different versions of characters are understood to exist in parallel fictional universes. And those different versions, what the Loki TV show called variants, they can interact with each other. When I started my career in my 20s as an editor at Marvel Comics, I was just at NYU, multiverse storytelling was already a long accepted practice. And so today I'd like to discuss how that practice came about for practical reasons and how the development of superheroes in movies and TV are using the same techniques for similar reasons and in ways that will be exciting for audiences in the years ahead. My whole life, I've had an interest in fantasy and superhero stories, and I'll cite examples here. If you're also a fan of them, I suspect you might know some of the intricacies of those worlds better than I do. I'm more interested today in just showing you the big picture rather than focusing on the smaller details of it. Now, the ways storytellers juggled multiple versions of characters goes way back to the dawn of humanity. Myths, religions. Let me use the Bible as an example because it's what I was raised with, but whatever formative stories your own cultures might have, they all work the same way. This is how humans build up stories in a cohesive manner. Folks look on the Bible as a single text, but it's really the accumulation of many stories passed down orally and linked through imperfect patchwork translations and editing. As a result, it really doesn't read as a seamless story. In the Old Testament, there are multiple accounts of the creation of the world. There are multiple accounts of Moses' travels through the desert. And whether you have multiple versions of the story, whenever you look at them, there's always going to be contradictions between them. Between the Old and New Testament, God actually acts in totally different ways in each section. They don't read like the same characters we would understand it in a modern sense. Some people explain this, that there was an actual historic reality there, but that what we've had is an imperfect written record that was passed down to us. Aaron wasn't podcasting what his brother Moses was doing during the 40 years in the desert. So we're rebuilding the story from oral traditions. The authors of those different accounts in the Bible are not confirmable. They're not what we would consider primary sources that we can actually look at. We can't see that source material. Closer to modern times, we have had popular shared stories like Robin Hood and King Arthur. It was always acknowledged with those stories that there might be a little kernel of historical truth there, but what we were hearing or reading were storytellers throughout history riffing stories with a concept. It was not considered they were really telling a true story with those characters. If Thomas Mallory's Morte d'Arthur told the Arthurian legend different than Geoffrey of Monmouth's version, no one really cared about that. As far as the audience was concerned, it was like fan fiction. There was no authority who owned the characters and whose job it was to make it all consistent. Comic book companies, though, are an authority. They are supposed to do that. It's actually what they're selling to the audience. And it's what I did as an editor at Marvel. It's what historically that editor job in comics was developed to be. To understand how that came about, we should look at the more recent history of how comics were made. Just as the Greeks had a gold and a silver and a bronze age of gods and heroes and then mortals, comics have had a gold, silver, and bronze era. It all started with no plan for consistency. But the longer the companies were around, the more the demands of the audience changed how editors and creators, writers and artists, were expected to build stories and maintain continuity between those stories. In the golden age of comics, when they come to prominence in the 1930s and 40s, comics were never meant to be preserved. They were printed on pulp paper. It was assumed no one would read them 10 years after they'd been published. There wasn't a huge attempt to make them consistent or true as we would understand it. Cranking out comics every month meant, as it still does, using many artists and writers to meet tight deadlines. They each have different styles. Bob Kane drew Batman differently than the way Dick Sprang drew Batman. The differences in style were understood by the audience to depict the same character. In the same way, Mallory and Geoffrey of Monmouth might have told a King Arthur story differently, but the audience recognized it as Arthur and wouldn't have demanded too much consistency past that. When the Silver Age of comics starts in the mid-50s, editors realized comics were not going away and that the comics had maintained their audiences. This created all sorts of challenges for the companies. Audience wanted all those stories to connect because they had all the issues and had been following them month to month. Audiences also wanted the characters to be modern to their time. But then how do you explain them being around for so long and not aging? And in addition, audiences, especially new readers, wanted characters that spoke to their current era. At DC, there was a historic editor, Julie Schwartz. He'd been involved with prose pulp writers in the 1930s. He'd edited comics since the 1940s, and now in the 1950s, faced with those challenges I mentioned, he boldly updated many of the DC heroes. He kept the cool names, often the same powers, but updated them to be more contemporary, more space-aged. This is what happened with Green Lantern and Flash. Julie's team explained any discrepancies with these changes by saying they were multiverses, a concept DC had first broached in the 1940s. They started it simple. There was an Earth 1 and an Earth 2. The old versions lived on one Earth dimension, the newer ones on the other. This is like if I said the Old Testament and New Testament God were different gods existing in parallel realities. This also meant that differences could be explored through multiverse crossover stories. In the 1960s, Stan Lee, the editor and main writer at Marvel, went through the same process. Sometimes Stan just threw out the dated character concepts and kept the catchy visual and name. He updated the Human Torch from being an android in World War II, which was very much a pulp concept of the time, to being a totally different Human Torch in the Fantastic Four to represent the rebellious teen culture of the readers in the 1960s. Sometimes the slide's going to change, I swear. Let's see. Okay, good. No. Go back. Okay, good. Sometimes he explained the history on how the same hero could be around all these decades, like how Captain America had been frozen in the ice in World War II and woke up as a man out of his time in the 1960s. At Marvel, they eventually followed DC's lead with a similar idea of alternate realities, like the DC Multiverse. Marvels were overseen by the Watchers. By the time of the Bronze Age, fans who had grown up with all this were now working at the companies as editors and writers. They were doing every permutation they could think of. Oh, hold on a second. Slides are getting pokey. Okay, wait. Okay, good. They were doing every permutation they could think of with multiverses colliding, getting destroyed, rebuilt, always in pursuit of new stories. Sometimes to simplify things for new readers, but often to reward older readers by exploring obscure backstory and proving that everything connected. The advantage here is that every comic exists in some form to this day. There are no lost books. There are no apocrypha. Everything counts to someone who owns the back issue it happened in. And so crossovers and multiverse stories utilize that. Now those Old and New Testament gods who existed in parallel universes could meet, fight, team up, or whatever. In comics, there's many storylines like Crisis on Infinite Earths and Age of Apocalypse that build off this concept. Now, when decent superheroes movies started being made in the later half of the 20th century, Superman, Batman, later the X-Men and Sam Raimi's Spider-Man, it was assumed that the characters' origins must be told from the start, and the stories kept simple because the average audience member was not familiar with comic stories and the intricacies. It was assumed every audience member was coming to the film as its own standalone thing, or that the movie related to at most 1 or 2 sequels. Often when an actor was recast, the movie franchise was rebooted. It wasn't like Dick Sprang or Bob Kane drew Batman in the comics, and even though they looked different, they were supposed to be the same. Michael Keaton played Batman. Then Val Kilmer did. Maybe it's the same dude in the same story. George Clooney, maybe. But when a series was laid to rest after 1 or 2 sequels, if more than a few years went by, it was assumed the storytellers had to go back to square one, as if those previous films did not exist or they didn't count. As a result, the same stories were told over and over. X-Men's Dark Phoenix story was told multiple times. Batman's origin was told multiple times. But sometimes something sly was done. So in X-Men First Class, they told early day stories of the X-Men, which meant they could recast Patrick Stewart with James McAvoy and Ian McKellen with Michael Fassbender. And this is where multiverse storytelling starts to really leak into movies. Because the movie X-Men Days of Future Past then did a time travel story where those different actors playing the same characters interacted. So is it a time travel story with multiple actors, or is it a parallel universe story? It's a blurry line that becomes very fascinatingly blurred as we go on. The biggest step in all this so far has been the Marvel Cinematic Universe, known as the MCU. The Marvel movies start from Iron Man onwards, when Marvel owned the rights to make movies of their own properties. I'm going to speak more about these rights issues in a moment because it leads to something very interesting. With the Marvel Cinematic Universe, it's not just about doing a movie, letting it fade, doing it again. It's a concentrated, organized plan to continually build story from the movies that have come before on the scale of what comics had done for hundreds of monthly comics over the decades. The closest thing on a much smaller scale had been the Universal horror films from the 1930s and 40s. With the Marvel Cinematic Universe, dozens of films over decades, a consistent continuity has been kept. As a result, the MCU is now dealing with the reality of changing actors as they get older or move on to other gigs. It's not like James Bond where they're just being recast. It's not like Bob Kane and Dick Sprang drawing Batman and you're supposed to ignore the different faces and pretend it's the same characters and ongoing stories. Robert Downey Jr.'s Iron Man dies out and there's no more Iron Man. We should have done a spoiler warning on this. For now, Chris Evans' Captain America passes the shield to Anthony Mackie's Falcon. Parallel to all that, a boring legal issue led to the start of a very interesting story possibility. Before Marvel had their resources together to make their own movies, they were selling the rights to characters to any studio they thought could make a decent film. There was little to no expectation that Marvel, a small comic book company, would ever have enough money or power to make a major motion picture on their own. They sold the Fantastic Four and X-Men to 20th Century Fox. They sold Hulk to Universal, and they sold Spider-Man to Sony. Those characters could only interact with the characters each company owned the rights for. Spidey at Sony couldn't be in stories with the Avengers characters at the MCU. Universal wound up only making flops. 20th Century Fox had mixed success with the Fantastic Four, doing a disastrous reboot after their first version. Sony had one good run with Spidey, one mediocre run with Spidey, and for the second Spider-Man reboot, Marvel came in to produce it for Sony, with the deal letting the Sony Spider-Man interact with the MCU. Technically, that Tom Holland Spidey was created from the start as a new MCU version. He debuted in the movie Captain America: Civil War. From the start, he was in the MCU, but the idea that a Marvel character owned by one company could interact with the MCU was starting to break down the walls of the multiverse. And then the animated film Into the Spider-Verse broke open multiverse storytelling for cinema directly. It dealt with, in story, in a movie, with the multiverse. Multiple Spider-Mans from different animated realities collided. It takes what's a comic book norm, alternate universe versions of our characters interacting in an adventure, and it tells a feature story with it. By this point, audiences were so familiar with comic book stories on screen that this next level of comic book story technique was fully accepted, even if they didn't know the backstory, or even if the writers made up new hero variants just for the movie. Spider-Man: No Way Home, the next Spider-Man live-action film, will similarly have previous movie Spider-Man, Tobey Maguire, Andrew Garfield, and the current one, Tom Holland, interacting with villains from all the movies. This is doing something different than Into the Spider-Verse did. It's doing something uniquely cinematic that has never been done on this scale before. It's taking what were existing cinematic reboots and combining them, taking what were theoretically obstacles for each reboot, trying to ignore the previous version, and saying they all exist and letting them reinforce each other to tell new stories together. It means every reboot isn't a restart. It's an adding to and reinforcing the saga for the audience. Like an Old and New Testament, it rewards the fans for watching all those films. It makes them care more about the stories because they have more combined hours, more stories they've watched with those characters that will inform the current movie. Reportedly, the upcoming feature, well, it's not reported, it's going to happen, but the upcoming feature, Doctor Strange Multiverse of Madness, will do similar things. The story for this movie was set up by the recent WandaVison TV show, which did something even freakier. Here's where the legal stuff comes in. So for many years, 20th Century Fox held the movie rights for the X-Men films. This gave them the rights to use Quicksilver, who's sometimes an X-Men character. They cast Evan Peters in the role. Meanwhile, Marvel Films, because of a legal loophole, also had the rights to Quicksilver, who sometimes features in the Avengers comics. They cast Aaron Taylor Johnson in the role for Avengers: Age of Ultron. Totally separate actors and characters and story histories, no overlap. But fairly recently, Disney, which owns Marvel, bought 20th Century Fox. So Marvel owns the rights to both versions technically. Wanda, the Scarlet Witch, is the sister of Quicksilver. So this acquisition allowed the producers of WandaVison, which deals with Scarlet Witch bending reality, to bring in the 20th Century Fox Quicksilver Evan Peters into the Marvel film TV world. It turns what was a corporate mistake of competing rights into a more intricate storyline. And the recent Loki TV show set up alternate universe, alternate versions of our heroes and villains who were unleashed by Kang, who will be the main villain of the MCU films to come. The new Flash film will be featuring Michael Keaton's Batman from the 1989 movie, among other Batman actors. So what's happened is we've come full circle. We have contradicting narratives in different movies, but we've created multiverse stories to explain it and can have new stories that will explore characters we love in new and pioneering ways. In old myths and religious texts, primary sources are lost, so we can only guess at how things connect. With comic books and their adapted movies, TV, and video games, no texts are lost. Writers and artists can build them into a constantly changing, coherent, evolving saga, an interwoven myth for our times. And that's one of those things I'm very excited about with storytelling. And I hope all you folks out there who will become storytellers in the future will bring into your arsenal as you tell new and different types of stories. Okay, Camille, that's my talk.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Professor Felder. That was really, really interesting. You kind of blew my mind a little bit and gave us a little taste as to what NYU academics looks like. So I am really excited to dive into Q&A. So if you are out there and you have a question for Professor Felder, please use the Q&A box to type your questions in there. We are going to take some questions from the audience. To kick us off, though, I'm actually curious about your background. Can you talk to us a little bit about how you got into writing and comic books and sort of where that interest started?
Yes, so well, I gang, especially for those of you interested in writing, I think if you're into storytelling, you find you're the one person in your class in high school and younger that likes to tell stories, or like you have one or two friends that do it. Um, I was sort of that kid. And I got to NYU and I bumped around a lot of NYU. This is one of the nice things about the size of this university. I was in the film program. Then most of my friends in the dorms were in the English program. I was in the English program. Then I was in Gallatin, which was a wonderful place. And I eventually found the family of folks who were like me. And while I was doing that, I interned at Marvel Comics. There's a lot of interning opportunities when you're here in New York City. And suddenly I was with a lot of people who were like me. I mean, not like me exactly, but loved story deeply and wanted it to be their lives. So, Camille, that's the long and short of it. Was I interned at Marvel and then I eventually got a job. Then I brought those skills back to NYU. And then there always was, even Jack Kirby, who you see, who I showed in a slideshow, there always was a history of comic book people working in animation because they're sort of allied. But certainly as we got into this multiverse and franchise building sphere we're in now, it was a very natural transition for me to go into animation. That's how I wound up getting into animation from NYU.
Yeah. No, that's really, really impressive. We actually have a follow-up from one of people in the audience who's asking,
Yeah.
how did you get the opportunity to intern at Marvel while you were a student at NYU? That
Oh,
sounds impossible.
okay. No. So NYU has a the technical thing is NYU has a wonderful relationship with many businesses of all types and media and all that in New York. So as an undergrad, usually you do intern, and so that was a thing. And so the real truth of it though is what happened was my best friend in the dorms um, was who went on to work on Heroes and a bunch of these other TV shows, but he was a bigger comic book fan than I was, even though I was a comic book fan. And he had gotten the interview to intern at Marvel, and his mom wanted him to go to law school at the time, and really he chickened out. And I had broken up with my girlfriend the week before, and I had like nothing. I really want to get my head off stuff, so I said, "Oh, let me go to an interview for you." And I went to the interview, and that was it. I mean, it's a long time ago, gang. It was another century, but it's the same thing. We have people who still intern at Marvel, and certainly whatever university you go to, but especially one like NYU, there's plenty of opportunities like that.
Yeah, I completely agree. It sounds like, fate really got you there, but also, of course, utilizing NYU's resources like our Wasserman Career Center. We have, nowadays, there's a platform called Handshake where you can actually look for these types of opportunities. So if you choose, for those of you in the audience, if you choose to come to NYU, you have a lot of these resources at your disposal. And like you said, Professor Felder, with NYU being in New York City, the access is completely unmatched. So I think that is a great, great story. Alrighty, so we have a question here from Selena who is asking, how would you incorporate this idea of multiverse into creative writing forms that are more accessible to teens? for example, short story, poetry, memoir?
So let me say this. I think the first most important, Celine, it's a deep, interesting question. It's one of those questions you sort of explore through life. Multiverse is fundamentally based on this idea of canon, of building story. And so the first thing to do is tell stories you care about. Then, depending on what the opportunities are, you do alternate versions of them. So, I mean, something that sort of precurses some of this multiverse I did too is if you're an anime fan, you'll notice that like anime, they do alternate versions of stories and it's not even considered a reboot. It's just considered, well, if the creator goes on something, they're going to tell a different story. So I don't think it's so much a case of you should be writing multiverse going into the shoot. It should be you should be writing stories that you care about and or poetry or whatever the form of it is. And then when it's done and you feel it's said what it has to say, then you ask the more provocative question of what different things can I do with those same elements? How can I make them exciting either for a different audience or a different time? And that will naturally layer up and give you the opportunities to do that.
No, that's awesome. That's really great advice. Thank you. And we have a question from Lisa. Hi, Lisa. So she's saying that there is an online opinion that the multiverses are used when writers run out of stories for their characters, or it's an easy way to kind of solve problems that are presented in a film or a story. And she's just kind of wondering what your thoughts are on that.
I don't agree, but it's not a case of like, for instance, of my generation, we used to say, "Oh, clone storylines. That's an easy ad. It's an excuse." There's certainly examples of that. I wouldn't doubt it, but let's consider two things. The first is some of the reason we do different stories that will layer up into multiverse are because we're trying to tell stories that really speak to the times we're writing for. And so we have a core concept like, let's say, Daredevil, if you're familiar with Daredevil. And Daredevil is a fairly punchy, fun, free-going character when he's created in the 60s, as most of those characters were. And then when Frank Miller and Klaus Janson and Denny O'Neil come to it in the 70s, they're very much are pulling out of the character things they think speak to the interest of that time, like kung fu movies, noir, more violent storytelling modes. And so what happens, Lisa, is we're left with multiple versions and multiple takes on the character. So I don't think there's anything wrong or easy to say, can we actually use those to build things going on that are more dynamic on the cued history of it? If you say, yeah, are they doing it to sell more action figures? Okay, that's crass. If you think a bad story comes out of it, yeah, it's not a good use. But one has to look at, Kevin Feige, who's the mastermind of all the Marvel films. He's inherited not just his movies, but now he's inherited the other versions of the Marvel films. And to say, can we excite the fans and tell a deeper story because they care about all those versions? I don't think it's a cheap use of it. But certainly you'll find, I mean, you can, is spam a good food to cook with? You can find good versions, you can find good dishes with spam, you can find like vile versions of it. So it's a question to ponder. I think it's a legitimate thing to consider.
Yeah. No, that's great. This whole topic is just kind of blowing my mind. I didn't realize how deep it could really get. So this is
sure.
very exciting. We also have a question from Brianna, who is asking about the Eternals film. So she's wondering, how do you think the new Eternals film and the Celestials will affect the multiverse?
Okay, so Brianna, let me first say, I haven't seen the movie yet because my wife and I have a 4-year-old son, and so arranging babysitting to get to see the films. But obviously I know the comics and all that. There's a question: how far can the Marvel film spread, and how much stories will come out of it? And so far, Feig just keeps spreading it. I think the Eternals and the Celestials and all that stuff. I think it's a very healthy, organic blossoming off of the Thanos storyline, and not to do any spoilers, and I haven't seen the film, but I know what the final credit sequence is, and if you've seen it, I'm not going to spoil it, but that character is very tied to Thanos, and it's a very legitimate thing to build on it. What Feig is trying to do is he's trying to build as wide as a tapestry to the movies as the comics do, and so we're going to have supernatural stories with Doctor Strange. We've been having cosmic stories with the Guardians of the Galaxy. We're going to have more urban and pedestrian level stories with the Hawkeye characters. So we're going to have finally more world cinema characters with characters like Shang-Chi, obviously. So I think it's a wonderful thing. I think it's a very organic thing. I think I would hope Feig wants to do with what they do with the comics, which is not every film is actually designed to be like every Marvel film fan has to go see it. You know, like some folks will want to see an Ant-Man film because it's more domestic comedy, and some will like like if you're a Dune fan, you'll probably like the Eternals more. So I think it's all healthy, and I think it's going to lead to very good stories. I think it's a totally natural place to take those stories and expand them.
Yeah. I actually think that's a great segue into this question that we got from Trisha, who says, do you think writers need to consider future perspectives when writing characters? For example, making them more open-minded or progressive? Or do you think writers can leave it up to future authors to change them according to their time?
This is a great and deep and weird question. It's wonderful. It's something we should always consider. There's when we look at characters and stories, ironically enough, because at one point Marvel was the name of the company was Timely, but we're looking at doing timely and timeless stories, and so we need to do universal stories that will speak to people in all ages. That's how we connect with audience, but that how we connect with them immediately is how it connects to our time. And with those stories that are great and lasting, they always have those elements. So it's not that I think you have to predict like what's going to be the norms of morality and point of view in the future, but we should always be looking at what is the core humanity and why are we telling stories as people? You know, why are we singing like the griot in like African cultures? Why are we singing of the triumphs and torments of our people? And there will always be those two levels. And if you do it right, there will always be things that you open up for. So like I said, like Daredevil is one type of thing when it's introduced, and then it speaks in the 70s, and then in the 80s when they get grimmer and grittier, it speaks to that. And so the more important thing is speak to humanity, speak to your point of view of it, and if you do that, everything sort of takes care of itself through the ages. I think that's really how it works.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great response. I think kind of piggybacking off of that, there's a question from Joseph who is asking, how could writers go about implementing multiverse concepts without diminishing the impact of their stories? And what techniques could be used to ensure that these alternate reality storylines hold the same weight, depth, and consequences?
Yeah. So the most important thing of is multiverse is something usually we deal with once we have multiple stories that are already up and working. So I think the key to it is what you're saying in the second half of that question is first tell stories that matter, first tell stories that you care about. And then when you build up a catalog of it, you think about the organic ways we can connect and build and deepen it. There are examples of folks building multiverse stories from scratch, but it's a little bit more complex. And I do think it tends to be flatter because until we know, you know, it's that thing of like, if you just arbitrarily said, I'm going to pick 5 people and say they're my family and invite them to Thanksgiving, they'd just be strangers. But if you have like 5 different family members that you interact with in different spheres and they've all got their own different hang-ups, and then you say, they hate being together, let me make a Thanksgiving meal and bring them together, it will make its own dynamic. So I think it's don't put the cart before the horse. The first thing is come up with the interesting characters. And then, you know, even when we look at things like what Filoni and Favreau are doing with the Star Wars universe now, once you tell enough compelling stories, then you will find the compelling ways to layer them up and multiverse them.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. I feel like you're kind of just segueing perfectly into the
Oh,
question
good.
from the audience.
Good.
Someone out there wants to know if you have any tips for people who are thinking about going into storytelling, whether it be in animation or literature, just any advice that you could share.
Um, okay, so there are texts and things you can study like Aristotle, but the honest truth is, what I want you to do is find one or two things you care deeply about. They don't have to be classics. They could be something that people think are junky but are important to you. It could be modern things like Squid Game. It could be classical stuff like the Iliad or War and Peace or the original Galactus story in the FF, whatever matters to you. And then I want you to start taking it apart and figuring out how they layer the story. And so the two things that complement each other is you find stories that you care about and take them apart, and you write your own stories and you figure out what's not working with them, and they will inform each other. And in that way, old authors that you care about will become your teachers. And then hopefully you'll find good teachers in life too. But I mean, that first step, I think, is trusting your taste in stories and then trying to figure out why those stories make you laugh or cry or pull you in or fill you with suspense. And that usually sets the road for you. But it needs to say it is important just to write, and you build muscle that way.
Yeah, awesome. And as we are starting to wrap up, we only have time for a couple more questions. But Keaton is wondering about your classes. So
Yeah.
if you were teaching a class like this, what would the class
Yeah.
size be like? Would there be discussion? What would people read? Can you just sort of walk us through what a class like this would look like?
Yeah. So gang, this is an applied topic. I'm just talking to you today because I thought it'd be fun to sort of open your mind to these things, which I'm sure you're already sort of buzzed about. Usually in the Department of Dramatic Writing where I teach, it's specific topics like specific to type of scripts you would produce. Like, so we do like half-hour TV, 1 hour TV, animated screen. I do teach a specific class just in what we call animation transmedia, which is you build a world and then you write a TV show, you write a TV pilot and a screenplay in it. But what we do here in the department, so there's big departments at NYU, there's small departments at NYU. They exist at that size for very deliberate reasons. We're a really small department within the bigger Tisch, art school. All our classes are 12 students or less. They're writing every week. They're getting feedback every week from me and the class, because like I was telling the previous person, read things you care about and try to take them apart. Some of the skill we're building in that classroom is how are you articulating how the other person's work is affecting you and what you think is working or not working, so that then when you go work on your own work, you're like, oh, gee, I told the person not to do that, so why am I doing it? So basically all our classes are very simple and small, 12 students or less. Everybody's writing script pages every week or outline pages every week, and then they're analyzing them and they're moving forward. So that's how the classes up here are done.
Yeah, I love that. Very different from my undergraduate experience with, a 300 person lecture. So
Yeah,
I appreciate
and certain programs and certain things we do at NYU work better at that size. But
that.
what we do here is very much an trainer, whatever you want us to call that, process. And we're a very small department. We have about 13 full-time faculty here. Our offices are usually open, and a lot of the learning happens when somebody comes into my office here, comes into my office and is like, oh God, I don't know what's going on in my third act. Why do my characters always stall in the third act? And so we take it apart. So it's very much one-on-one learning. We have to do it for storytelling that way.
Yeah, no, I love that. It sounds really like a great experience for the students that get to be in that department and take your classes. I actually would like to sign up. So if you have any space for me, I would love to.
I'll let you know.
Awesome. And then for our last question,
Yeah.
Someone out there would love to know about your experience teaching at NYU. So what, in your opinion, is unique about NYU classrooms and students? Like, what are things that excite you about teaching at NYU specifically?
Okay, so yeah, there's two things here. I mean, I was an undergrad at NYU. I was a grad at NYU. I've taught at NYU. I've spent most of my life here. not by design. It's just because I was constantly finding what I needed here. So every department's different, but this department to me very specifically has been a family. And so how we teach and what we do here is very informed by that. And that's why I came here, and it's how I've taught, and it's how I've always sought mentors in that way. So Camila, did I answer the question? That I don't know if I fully answered the question with that. It's just
Yeah.
that is the spirit of what we do here, and it's why I've stayed around, and it's fundamental to how we do things up here. It's just one, and the student body. Look, we get students from all over the world. I can't speak so much to other departments, but because I don't know them that well, but we get a very diverse body here. They're very different, but like I said, they're all the one person in their group who used to be really into stories. And so even though they're all different personalities and different backgrounds, they all care deeply about story here. And so that's some of what the university tends to do, is it tends to bring people from all over and have them linked by something they care about. I mean, that's been my NYU experience since 1989.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think that's a perfect answer. I think one thing I love about NYU is that it's a big place, but no matter what your interests are, no matter what your passions are, you will find your people, you find your place here. And I think you just spoke to that so beautifully. So we unfortunately do have to wrap up. Professor Felder, I don't know if you are okay with sharing your email address, or maybe something else where people can get in touch with you.
So gang, if you want to reach out, if you go on the Tisch website and you Google Department of Dramatic Writing, I'm in the faculty. Just look at the faculty listing, and I have an email there. You can drop me a line if you want, no problem.
Yes, because there are a ton of questions that we unfortunately didn't have time to get to. But thank you so much, Professor Felder. This session was absolutely incredible. The audience was so engaged, and I think they are dying to just hear about all of your opinions on what's to come.
Okay.
And thank you to our audience, of course, for being here. Before we officially wrap up, I just wanted to share a few ways that you can stay connected with us throughout the coming months. If you have questions about your application, if you have questions, you can reach out to us at admissions@nyu.edu. If you are interested specifically in NYU Abu Dhabi, you can reach out to us at nyuad.admissions@nyu.edu. And of course, if you are interested specifically in NYU Shanghai, you can reach us at shanghai.admissions@nyu.edu. Please be sure to check out our other offerings by visiting this link that I am pasting in our chat. Our next Trailblazer session is actually on Wednesday, December 1st. So we hope to see you there. And with that, thank you all so much for joining us today. We hope to welcome you to campus soon. And thank you so much again, Professor Felder. This was really, really incredible. We appreciate it.
Okay, folks, be well.
Awesome. Bye now.